prompted you to do this migration? You had a tech stack, but you felt like you needed to change it?
Yeah, there were a number of factors. Really, our data model needed a lot of upgrades. There were customers who were dependent on that data model, which is kind of this interesting intersection of like, a business requirement to keep serving something, but also a technical requirement to get off of it because it's becoming like less scalable or too complex or too archaic. The other part was that technology had sort of dwindled. It was pretty old. And some of the architectural decisions by that time that had been made strategically kind of put the software in a corner, where it wasn't really easy to pivot out of. I know this is something that like you listen to software leadership podcasts and, read books on this stuff. Like there are people who talk about architecture is strategy, and you're constantly trying to think 1-2 steps ahead of like, if I make this decision, do I have a way to get out of it or a way to back out or a new direction that I can go in from there? And I think this software just over time, with the confluence of priorities and parameters that were on it, it landed itself in a corner where it really couldn't shift that much anymore. There was really this kind of burgeoning choice of like migrate or die. And so we migrated.
Interesting. Tell me a little bit more about the technical choices there. Was there anything in particular that really stuck out to you as like, oh, that's what's killing us, like this particular choice?
There's a couple factors here. The bigger one that I would say is probably there were choices made for expediency that I think in the short term helped deliver something, but like towards as that decision like piled up over years, it became sort of unscalable. So think about, with a service catalog, you deal with a lot of data throughput. Older service catalogs you'll see are very batch oriented. They get like very bursty workloads. And bursty workloads are, like they're hard to adapt to because then you have to schedule a lot of resources for, whatever the peak of that workload is going to potentially be. Otherwise, you start to have most likely catastrophic failure across the system. So I think that's probably one of the bigger things that we started to see is that where we were storing like simple decisions, like, taking column in an RDBMS and storing JSON values into it that you just keep appending to over time. It turns out RDBMSs don't really like that too much. Like when that individual cell across a whole column gets really massive per row, it starts to do like really interesting things to the performance characteristics of the RDBMS. Like there's no way to optimize that. You just have to shift. I think one of the other big motivating factors was getting away from the back end. Even in the front end, there's some difficulty there because our libraries were so outdated that you couldn't linearly upgrade anymore. Which was a really interesting problem to have. Like React is stuck like major versions behind. There's a point in like you have a dependency on a certain component library and you can't like upgrade through that. It becomes really tricky because then at some point you actually have to like break and rewrite your front end in order to like get a new front end, which then, opportunity cost starts to look at like, well, why wouldn't we just do that all in one big swoop, right? There's always a temptation of like, yeah, if we're going to have to go rewrite our front end and we've decided that our back end is not optimal, why don't we just do both?
That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
So just because some folks might not be clear with it, what is a service catalog?
Yeah, that's a great question. A service catalog, you can think of it like the Dewey Decimal System of an enterprise. It's only really big companies tend to have these kind of things, and it's where you have so many services that people can't name them with their memory or their fingers or whatever. Like there's too many services powering either the enterprise or the core products or whatever, that people can't find information out about them anymore. So you need a catalog to go find them. In really large, I would say like competent enterprises, what you see is, or like software competent enterprises, is that you see a service catalog play a larger role in connecting different systems across the enterprise. So it sort of becomes like your like nerve center of your enterprise. It knows a little bit about everything. It doesn't know everything about everything, but it knows enough to point systems at other systems. So think about like if I wanted to understand how to contact a given team, and the enterprise supports, Slack or email or PagerDuty as like main forms of contact information, something's got to tell me how to get to the point, whether it's a web endpoint or whether it's an ID or an email address. Something's got to tell me how to get there, because as you grow as an enterprise, you have these common needs to programmatically be able to do that, to have systems that do that on behalf of other systems. And so that's what a service catalog does across an array of subjects, not just, contacting people.
Perfect. That's an awesome overview. You mentioned scale earlier and how this system had hit a tipping point with scale. Where did you see the points of integration? Because as you described, service catalogs act as the primary hub for describing information. But what are some of those sources of load that will actually create scale internally on this service?
In our old world, there were a lot of bursty workloads that I would say were a threat to the service, because the way that we would provision that service is it almost, I used to joke that it kind of looked like a game server at times. Like it was provisioned really heavily, which, if you take one glance at it, you're like, oh my gosh, like why do we have a game server provisioned in the cloud for this kind of thing? And it's like, well, when this thing gets slammed with requests, because like you don't get to decide when your users make requests, right? Like they make them when they need them, and you need to be prepared to absorb them as a service owner. We would see just an influx of poorly timed requests that everybody made a request all at once, and you just, the backend got slammed, and maybe we weren't able to serve the pages. But there were also simple missteps, like when that service first stood up, it was really small. It served a very specific purpose, and so it didn't have like pagination built in, because like, if you're building a backend and you have this small, finely scoped use case, building something like pagination may just seem like overhead that you don't want to do.